And so it's my very big pleasure today to introduce a friend and a colleague. His name is Johnny Bertolio. He's originally from northern Italy. He's born close to Turin. And he graduated, so he has an MA from the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. I don't know if you know what is it. It's a sort of institute for advanced study. We call it the Scuola Normale, so the normal school, but it's rather extraordinary. And you enter only, it's like Ivy League, but you enter only after a very tough selection, and it's completely for free. Once you're in, they pay for everything, and it's considered like the top education that we do have in Italy. And he has his PhD instead from the University of Toronto in Canada, and at the University of Toronto he studied Italian language, literature, and culture. He now works primarily as an author, as an editor, and as a workshop designer in the humanities, and he works for a publishing house, and this is how I met him, that is the publishing house Blusher, that publish primarily books for middle, high school, and university. And well, he's published a lot of things, I would say scholarly, so he has worked on Renaissance authors like Leonardo Bruni. But more recently, so in 2022, he has published Control Canon, and I bought my copy that I can pass you around if you want to give a look. Control Canon is imagined like a support book for Italian high school, so it's not a primarily survey book, so it's short, but is dedicated to the exploration of the literature of women from the origins, so from the beginning of the Italian literature, meaning the 12th, 13th century until today. And it has had a lot of success, so they're reprinting it multiple times. And what has happened, what we've seen, is that many Italian schools, they have adopted as the book for the holidays for the student, not to explore something different. He's now preparing a very similar project that is on the field of history, and that will came out as a support manual about the other histories, so the forgotten people, no? Speaking about diversity, speaking about LGBTQ+, speaking about women, speaking about people of other ethnicity in Italy. And we'll work specifically on history, and will come out next year, if I'm correct. So today is presenting to us a lecture that is as titled Muse, revising the Italian, the Canon in teaching Italian literature and history. So it's about his former project and his next project. And what we're trying to do is building a little bit a series. So I remind you once again that our next conference will be on the 7th of November. We will have an employee of the Italian Parliament that should work pretty recently to change the law about a state permit for the American students. But she's now part of several commission also in the European Parliament about the gender pay gap. So somehow completely different perspective, but we will still speak about gender. Okay, so it's my very big pleasure to introduce you to Johnny, and please don't be shy. So Johnny will welcome a lot of questions as soon as we finish. Okay, ciao.
Grazie, thank you Laura for the introduction, and also Professor Ciaselli for the invitation. And I hope I will not ruin your view of Italy during this talk. According to a long-standing tradition, officially dating back to the age of unification after 1861, literature and history as subjects in the Italian school system have played a pivotal role from a political point of view. The first Italian ministers of public education, as they were called at that time, now it is the Ministry of Education and Merit, forged a curricula where the ideal author that was meant to be studied by new generations of Italian boys girls had a different list, corresponded to a precise profile: politically engaged in favor of the Risorgimento, Catholic but anti-clerical, male, white, and heterosexual, linguistically Tuscan. In a young and fragmented nation like Italy at that time, male politicians felt the need to found school programs on the basis of a strong and coherent literary and historical tradition that ended up excluding all authors, both men and women, who did not correspond to the prevailing paradigm. Today we will examine some instances of these exclusive and non-inclusive tendencies, and we will explore some alternatives so as to deconstruct the idea of a regular model by means of queer studies. It is well known that queer studies help us to analyze how gender roles, stereotypes, and barriers have been defined and defied in different historical circumstances until nowadays. By reappropriating the derogatory term queer, scholars of queer studies prefer this umbrella definition more than gay or lesbian, so as to include all marginalized identities and orientations that did not identify in the norm and have been often persecuted and brutalized. From our point of view, queering the literary and historiographical canon may be a way to reveal the narrow-minded and rhetorical structure of it, and free all the authors that have been forcefully aligned to the hegemonic paradigm. Not only queer authors, gay, lesbian, transsexual, and non-binary, but also straight authors, both men and women, not only history of queer communities, but also history with capital H, have been misrepresented and sometimes misunderstood, so as to confirm the thesis of a uniform and linear pattern to propose to students and learners. In doing so, I will invoke the inspiration of the 10th Muse, a queer and finally non-binary muse who will help us to deconstruct what their 9 sisters did, being forced by male poets. So if in my speech I will address the muse, you know who I am talking to. Don't be surprised. There were many reasons why female writers have been disregarded in the panorama of history of Italian literature. For centuries, unfair biases have weighed on their shoulders, that they write only about themselves and their sentiments and feelings, especially love, that their works are not worthy because they merely reproduce canonical masterpieces, that they have no peculiar style, and in Italian academia, style has been for a long time the main theme of PhD thesis, so as to get a university job as professors. Now, if there were ages when women's presence was low in the published titles, that happened for social factors: limited access to education and libraries, familiar duties imposed upon them, the impossibility to pursue a career out of the domestic sphere. Let's take Dante, an author from our beloved Florence that any literary handbook and also magazines produced in Italy celebrates as the father and the inventor of Italian language and literature, if not of the national idea of fatherland Italy. Durante di Alighiero degli Alighieri, called Dante, Durante was too long for Florentines, came from a wealthy, although non-aristocratic family living downtown. He had an irregular but solid education and had access to private and public libraries under his unorthodox bisexual teacher, Brunetto Latini, then punished in the Inferno as a sodomite, and apparently Dante was the only one to know this. Albeit through difficulties, young Dante took advantage of his freedom by traveling alone, attending cognate poets and politicians, fleeing across central and northern Italy once he was exiled from Florence and sentenced to death. Yet he was not illiterate. He didn't suffer any vexation from his parents or from his wife Gemma, never mentioned in his works, by the way. He didn't travel nor walk with heavy clothes covering his body for more decorum. He was not sold as a slave nor as a prostitute. He didn't risk harassment. He didn't die in childbirth. Is it then so strange that the genius of Dante popped out in a medieval man instead of a woman? Can we really think that his talent is the result of a divine inspiration or the influence of the sign of Gemini under which he was born on April 1265? Or did his literary passion grow from an already fertile and privileged soil? More or less in the same age of Dante, another poet was born in Tuscany, and her sonnets are preserved in the same medieval manuscript of other famous medieval poets, meaning that she was quite famous back then. She was a woman whose life is not very known, if not from what she herself wrote in her verse. Her name was Compiuta, and other Tuscan authors called her donzella, meaning unmarried. She would have liked to enter a monastery provided that she could avoid an unpleasing marriage. At that time, remaining single was inconceivable for a woman, so any girl had only two options, marriage or cloistered monastery, in both cases inside and behind walls. In her sonnets, instead of complaining about an unfaithful man, Compiuta begs her father to accept her decision to become a nun. In her words, in fact, my father put me in a suffering situation and often keeps me in tormented pain. He wants to forcefully give me to a man, but I neither desire nor want this, and I always live in a great sorrow. Her sonnets are precocious hymns on dismantling patriarchy, with good phrases, original rhetorical devices, and a recognizable style. They are queer, dear Muse, in that they clearly reveal the gender barriers and different destiny for medieval girls and boys. Also from a strictly literary point of view, Compiuta's poems defy the normal dynamic of lyric poetry, where a male lover celebrates his beloved, and focus instead on her life's circumstances and desires without any male addressee, except for her tyrannical father, who is, however, present in third person. If we started to recount the history of Italian literature from Compiuta, we would have a completely different perception of Italian culture, and we could also aim at reflecting in a more genuine and effective way on our present society. If having merit means to defy rules and win over time, Compiuta has got considerably more merit than Dante, whose name enjoyed fortune as one would expect. A predictable fortune, but surely not a stable one. Dante himself took decades, if not centuries, to be wholly accepted as a poet. And in his case, too, we see how our queer muse can free him and his production from canonical restrictions. Dante is well known for his celestial comedy, the so-called divine comedy, a poem split into three parts: Inferno, hell, purgatory, purgatorio, and paradise or heaven, paradiso, the Christian other world's realms he had the arrogance to visit before his death. The fact that he wrote in Italian instead of Latin caused him the disdain of other severe writers, who considered his comedy a comedy, something that artisans, butchers, bakers, and other Florentine workers read for their amusement. This is what someone said. Not a theological poem that could have been analyzed in schools. However, the political stance of Divine Comedy, its invectives against the corruption and moral vices, its appeal to an Italian unification against foreign armies, were to reinforce in time the role of Dante as father of Italy. So after his personal exile and Roman Catholic Church's critique to his poem, Dante was even damned by some discontent friars in the same hell he celebrated. In the monumental cemetery of Pisa, you can observe the presence of Dante, protected in vain by his mentor Virgil, famous Latin poet, among the souls and bodies of sinners banned from Archangel Michael after the Armageddon. This portrait of Dante tells a different story compared to that one of a laureate poet that everyone unconditionally admired. Being burned in the infernal flames, he had to earn his posthumous fame by the sweat of his brow. Dante became the prophet of Italy as a nation during the Risorgimento in the 19th century. Until then, another Tuscan poet, Petrarch, was more the idol of literary crowds in Italy than Dante. On the eve of Italian unification, patriots fished out Dante from the lake of history and placed themselves under his scowling protection. Ask the queer Muse, or Professor Laura Finelli, to bring you to Piazza Santa Croce, where you will admire a severe statue of Dante inaugurated in 1865, when Florence became capital of all Italy. Italian politicians took advantage of Dante in two main directions. From a linguistic point of view, Dante being Florentine and the Florentine language being the basis of the new Italian, his poetical verses could be used both as literary and as linguistic models for the pupils of the nation. And from a political point of view, Dante raged against Italy's political division, and although his views were technically more European than simply Italian, with a universal emperor and the Pope at the top, Italian politicians insisted on his plea for prosperous and autonomous Italy. Also, in an age of imperialism and colonialism in the 19th century, the idea of a nation with no foreign armies and with a recognized ethnic background allowed the Italian government to compete with the other Western countries in the exploitation, especially of Africa. We can only imagine what happened in schools opened in Libya and later Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea, where Italian teachers taught Dante and read in class his verse about a nation to defend from foreign peoples. And there was also a city named after him, Dante, now Khartoum, in Somalia. Dante, who considered Kurdish Salah al-Din at the same level of other paramount white kings and princes, Dante, who accessed Muslim sources on the other world through his mentor Brunetto Latini, who visited Muslim Spain, Dante, who well knew the divide between Shia and Sunni, Dante, who was to inspire Afro-descendant author Amiri Baraka, writing about segregation in his novel The System of Dante's Hell, well, Dante, regrettably, became the weapon of the most sinister and menacing nationalism. Queer Muse help us to be aware of this global history of depredation where Italy was a protagonist, not a passive spectator. The legend of the Italiani brava gente, Italians are good people, is a legend, a historical lie who unfortunately recent news continue to prove wrong. What is interesting in the case of Dante at school is that his pivotal role as father of Italian literature shaded all the flaws of his works. As Renaissance literati pointed out, Dante wrote very well in Florentine, but poorly in Latin. They made fun of his childish attempts to emulate ancient Roman authors, writing poems, letters, and treatises in a language that he only knew by reading few original works that survived in the Middle Ages, and those technical works of medieval thinkers, philosophers, theologians, that used Latin as a business language with a specific vocabulary without any literary taste. Dante's Latin is bad, no doubt about that, but Dante is Father Dante also when he writes badly. And so in Italian schools, nobody will abstain from reading some pages of his Latin political treatises because of his invocation of a unified Italian language or of the necessarily layman status of politics. This side of Dantean thought, too, perfectly mirrored the spirit of Italian patriots and politicians in the Risorgimento. Italy as a nation was born, in fact, in spite of and against the Roman Catholic Church. Until 1870, the Pope was not a simple spiritual leader, but a sovereign ruling over Rome and its region, Lazio, and before then on a larger area from Bologna to Benevento in the south. On top of that, the King of Naples and Sicily had a strong relation with the Pope, and before the unification, he did his best to protect the Church's kingdom from the annexation to Italy. For decades, the Pope considered himself a prisoner of the new Italian state. Until 1929, under fascism, no formal agreement was signed between the Italian government and the Holy See. It is then clear why 19th century Italian patriots emphasized the anti-clerical side of Dante's thought. Once again, as a man for all seasons, Dante served the political objectives of the layman ruling class of young Italy. The fact that Dante wrote his solid political theory in poor Latin was a detail. His poor Latin was deemed to be a profitable means to educate pupils more than the impeccable Italian of poet Compiuta. Queer Muse, you have a long road ahead. It is important to remember that back in the 19th century, boys and girls were granted a different education, and some authors studied by boys were not considered appropriate for girls. It goes without saying that only few girls reached the higher level of education, and under fascism, when the gender roles were strictly defined, it was rare, if not impossible, for a woman to enter the university system as a student, and also fascism prohibited women from teaching humanities. Pedagogues and experts, both men and women, discouraged teachers from reading in class atheist or tricky authors, because they believed that young people needed encouragement to become proactive supporters of the fatherland as soldiers and workers, as fathers and mothers. It is then obvious that those political, ideological, and linguistic criteria that put Dante on the nation's pedestal excluded all authors, in particular women writers, who accomplished fame only when a man or a group of men decided to promote their works. Studying today the works of Compiuta, of famous mystic saints of the likes of Caterina of Siena, of Renaissance female poets such as Vittoria Colonna or Gaspara Stampa, who celebrate spiritual and secular love, of actresses and divas such as Isabella Andreini, of courtesans such as Veronica Franco, will have a major impact on us as students and future employees in the varied world of international companies and business. To study their works doesn't simply mean to increase the burden of things to do at school. It means to enlarge and differentiate the perspective of our gaze and include also those authors that gained success in life with their works being published and celebrated but did not survive the bottleneck of the Risorgimento age, when the official Italian literary canon was born under the mantle of a misrepresented Dante. The biographies and works of empowered women, the poems of gay and lesbian authors that did not have to hide their sexual orientation under myth and metaphors, and the more recent novels of authors who tell of their experience as Italians coming from other cultures are all precious treasures that we should unveil in class. In fact, they make up a struggling and challenging counter-canon, as I called it. The world out there, from big companies to movies, musicals, series, and TV shows, is promoting variety and diversity corresponding to and mirroring their audience. And there is no reason why school programs should ignore that by pretending that diversity is only a modern and fictitious product of a woke spirit. The queer muse has always existed. The queer muse has been always everywhere. And once they have emerged, there is no need to cover them with any fictitious rhetoric. We just have to locate and describe them as they are. You can clap. Speaking about marginalized communities and social groups, we will now look at how history has been taught in Italy from unification on. First of all, we should not forget that history meant for a long time national or European history. Other cultures and countries, when present, were analyzed through Eurocentric lenses, using terms and expressions, especially in the case of native peoples, that nowadays are thankfully considered derogatory and are banned. That said, history, more than literature, is undeniably a subject exposed to selection, orientation, and manipulation. Only recently, thanks to the approach of global history, handbooks are adopting a different perspective. But in high schools and universities, the Eurocentric gaze often persists. So please, Queer Muse, help us to see and abolish those cultural and geographic barriers that make us believe in more or less civilized peoples, in more or less worthy cultures and thoughts, in European discoveries that artificially divided ages and human beings. The first Italian governments between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century gave preference to more recent times in the school curricula. That implied that students from primary schools focused on the history of the Risorgimento and on how Italy finally became a nation. Only a few students reached the higher levels of education, so it was imperative that children from different Italian regions were precautiously exposed to the prevailing narrative. Since unification was perceived in some areas, for example in the former kingdom of Naples and Sicily, as an imperialistic conquest from the north, teachers and textbooks had to present a more balanced view to integrate all local communities and make them feel part and parcel of the nation. Under fascism from 1923 to 1943, the unique textbook imposed by the regime reconceived all Italian history since the Roman Empire as a linear pattern where the present recalled the glorious past. It was in the fascist age that students started to delve into Roman history in a systematic way, something that could reinforce knowledge of those studying Latin in the first year of middle school. Of course, the fascist government of Benito Mussolini was interested in presenting a monolithic and consistent view of all Italian tradition. The regime called to duty and misused as models even the most irregular and non-canonical figures of the Italian past and present, such as St. Francis, again Dante, and all the different spirits of the Risorgimento, such as Giuseppe Garibaldi and his wife Anita from Brazil, who were interpreted as the founders of an era that culminated in the fascism. Enormous monuments, tombs, memorials were built in the towns that bore memories of the patriots, while statues and paintings, both in Italy and in African colonies, emphatically celebrated the history of Italy, and from 1938 on, of the Italian race. That was the year of the fascist manifesto of the Italian race. Many intellectuals, philosophers, historians, and academics, as well as women poets and novelists, were involved primarily through prizes and governmental institutions in the fascist propaganda. Institutionalized racism turned into the segregation and deportation of Jewish communities to Italian and Nazi concentration camps. At the same time, the idea of a pure and healthy race discriminated against all men and women who did not conform to the familiar and moral customs promoted by the regime. For that reason, homosexuals, especially men, and transgender people were confined in penal colonies where they lived in poverty and discomfort and faced discrimination by other political prisoners. The most famous case was a group of 45 gay men of Catania in Sicily who were spied upon, reported, arrested, physically searched, and then forced to move to San Domino, a small island of Tremiti near the coast of Puglia. Italian photographer Luana Rigolli recently dedicated a documented project to them with touching images, data, and even their fingerprints. At the same time, women who refused to marry the men chosen by their families were interned in asylums with the complicity of family doctors and the support of penal law. Entering an asylum back then meant, in many cases, to be burned alive without enjoying basic liberties anymore. It is these understories, as I call them in a recent editorial project, that we need to study to have an idea of the impact of canon, of norm, and ultimately of history. This is, of course, in order not to repeat the same mistakes in the present, but also to see more varied nuances of cultures and cultural models at work in the past. Queer history as a subject may operate in various directions. This will allow us not only to rediscover the history of minorities and forgotten identities and communities, but also to look at how they were represented and narrated in official and canonical accounts. This may also be interesting to explore in monuments, sculptures, and paintings that we admire in our museums, palaces, and squares, something that you will probably do with Professor Laura Finelli during class trips and excursions. It is interesting to explore in particular how diversity pervaded fine arts, although often annihilated by racism and prejudice of the dominant power. Yet the representation, for example, of people from the East, such as ambassadors, sultans, noblemen, and women from the Byzantine as well as Islamic world, may be an instructive point of entry into that knot of global connections that is at the roots of our present. Let's take a typically Eastern side, that is the visit of the three kings to little Jesus in Palestine, painted, among many others, by Benozzo Gozzoli here in Florence, on this street, actually, in the Palace of Medici Dynasty in 1459. The frescoes that cover the walls of the palace's chapel celebrate not only the sacred episode, but more importantly, the commissioners, that is the Medici family, and all the ruling and intellectual class in power. The painter, in fact, immortalized the faces of the main politicians, bankers, and the writers of Florence at that age, so as to offer the idealized portrait of an entire world. And from what did artist Benozzo Gozzoli take inspiration for the elegant and decorated clothes of his characters, supposedly coming from the East, as the three kings with their respective cortege? From the Council of Florence, an international event occurred in Florence, of course, 20 years earlier in 1439. At that time, the Catholic Church of Rome and the Orthodox Church of Constantinople signed the Unification Act and temporarily overcame the previous schism. This extraordinary event took place in the presence of the main secular and religious authorities of both churches, the Pope and the Patriarch, the leaders of Florence, and the Byzantine Emperor with his brother. According to critics, the three Byzantine leaders have been immortalized as the three kings in Benozzo's frescoes. You can see the Emperor, his younger brother, and the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the Patriarch, Joseph II, died in Florence during the council, so you can admire his tomb in the church of Santa Maria Novella with a fascinating Greek inscription, not Latin, but Greek, because Greek was his language and the Orthodox Church's language. Behind the three kings, some dromedaries and mules carry huge packages accurately wrapped that contain goods and especially ancient Greek manuscripts to move to Italy due to the imminent Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. E-commerce testing, so to speak. You buy in Turkey, you receive in Florence. It is by looking at similar crossroads of cultures where seas become bridges and not walls, where borders become permeable and not insuperable, where colors become part of a rainbow and not subordinated to any hierarchy, that we may acquire a less biased sense of history. Of course, this will lead us straight to the delicate question of what to do with the uncomfortable traces of our past. As Afro-descendant writer Jaba Shego wrote, everything must be rediscussed and shared. More than looking at what is right or wrong in the present, we should emphasize the relations, the connections. This approach must also pervade our minds while facing in schools history of non-Italian regions. Let's take two examples from the 18th century, the glorious Settecento, which is always labeled in textbooks as the age of revolutions. The Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Here the queer Muse will have to show off all their power because those events, albeit revolutionary, have been canonized according to a stereotypical and faceted paradigm. I will not delve into the Industrial Revolution. Thanks to Marxist historians, we are quite aware of injustices and abuses against workers, especially women and children, under the cruel and no-law age of beginning capitalism. The political revolutions at the end of the 18th century in the future United States, as you know, and in France, have instead been presented in a rigid way. Let's start with the American, or more appropriately, US Revolution. In some 13 colonies, populated and ruled by mainly Caucasian people and with European origins and non-Catholic Christian beliefs, something that makes them unorthodox in that sense, break their loyalty to the British Crown and become independent with the support of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Well, the always forgotten part of this story is the role played by the original inhabitants of these lands in the political turmoil, to which the numerous communities of native peoples that fought together with the British army, hoping to gain protection from the crown against the hunger for land of the colonies. The same British law that disappointed the 13 colonies, that is the proclaim of George III, that in 1763 forbade them to acquire territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains without his previous authorization, was welcomed by natives as the sign of British support to their cause. Native peoples were explicitly quoted in the Declaration of Independence, with derogatory terms I would like not to repeat here, as means of the British king to put pressure on the colony's borders. In 1779, an expedition organized by George Washington with about 4,600 soldiers devastated fields, orchards, warehouses, even tombs of Haudenosaunee, historically Iroquois or Iroquois, in the territory of the future state of New York, something that proved that people had a degree of culture and technical and scientific expertise which had nothing to do with the Western commonplaces about them. Being aware of such massacres doesn't mean that we must trigger a new witch hunt and destroy with dynamite all the signs of them. It means that we must contrast and refuse all the rhetoric and canons that celebrate a unique interpretation of history. And I don't really like how some scholars try to explain the inhumane habits of past people in the name of the context, the historical context. This is an approach that runs the risk of legitimating racism and discrimination, not only to explain the past, but also to justify the present. If If we have to speak about context, first of all, we should use the plural, context. In the 18th century, there was a context where racism was authorized and nourished by politicians and scientists. But there was also a context, even among white people, such as Quaker communities, where those theories and massacres were disapproved of and firmly rejected. And finally, there is our context, meaning our brains and judgment of young students and adult teachers that, thanks to the queer Muse, have the opportunity to recognize the different facets of our past. The same approach in queering and unveiling the real foundations of historical narrations can be applied to the French Revolution. This event is presented in schools and was, in fact, a turning point in history. The political and societal model deemed to be the only possible back then fell apart. France became, albeit temporarily, a republic. Classes were redesigned, not abolished, a new and more plural government and parliament settled in. Yet, as in the case of the US Revolution, official documents and declarations of the French revolutionary men have a profoundly white, liberal, and individualistic spirit that ended up excluding many people from political and civil rights. That was true both for women and for the non-white and non-wealthy people living in the territories overseas. In reality, many French women of different classes actively participated in the revolution. Some of them directed journals and magazines, wrote books, organized meetings, addressed public appeals. A feminist of the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, came to Paris from Great Britain to see with her own eyes what was going on and wrote a historical account of it. Some revolutionary women reforged the gender paradigms and roles, something that even the most progressive of the revolutionary men were not ready to approve and promote, speaking about context. I would like to recollect two of them. Olympe de Gouges, a quite famous writer and activist, wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, a sort of counter-declaration of the rights of men and of the citizen of 1789, which had inaugurated a new regime. In it, Olympe de Gouges doesn't simply rewrite the original rights, changing the perspective from male to female individuals, relocating political power from men to women citizens of the French Republic. The Gouges Declaration is actually the quintessence of diversity and inclusion as nowadays we perceive it, speaking about another context. In that, she imagines a society where all citizens, both men and women, may work together and collaborate with the same objectives and with the same rights. As she wrote, if women can go out to the gibbet to be beheaded, they also have the right to go out to the podium to public speak and defend themselves. Another revolutionary woman who was involved more directly in some gory episodes was Théroigne de Méricourt. She walked around armed, something that was the proof of having civil rights, but while delivering a public speech, she ran the risk of being lynched by the crowd, and this was a trauma for her, who spent the rest of her life in an asylum. Théroigne de Méricourt embodied a new paradigm of woman, with no fear of bearing weapons, no fear of dressing differently from the tradition, no fear of speaking in public. In all her actions, she defied canons, patriarchal roles, space barriers that confined women inside and let only men outside. It is through her and other women's examples that the most canonical events of history acquired a more varied and less rigid connotation. Although they were marginalized and silenced, hit and killed, their courage and strong beliefs tell us that the context of discrimination might produce resistance and resilience. The name of Lampe Rouge opens another window to the question of diversity in the modern age. She in fact wrote a drama on slavery, known with the title of The Slavery of Black People, which addressed another issue that was very dear to her. Of slavery and racism, intellectuals and politicians of different countries were becoming more and more aware. They started to emphasize how the Enlightenment promoted education, freedom, and innate rights for individuals, but not for everyone. Ethnic minorities, as well as women, continued to be excluded from the political life of new governments, while riots overseas shed light on slave trade. The fourth revolution that we should add to the historical account of the 18th century was in fact a rebellion of slaves in the French colony of Haiti, the western side of the island called Saint-Domingue at that time. The riot started in 1791 and slowly but inexorably led to the independence of this region in 1804. Neither the French army under the revolutionary government nor Napoleon managed to repress the riot, and the appeal for independence and for the abolition of slavery coming from Afro-descendants who lived in the island and who suffered for generations in sugarcane plantations. In the years of Haitian Revolution, the first Afro-descendant elected congressman took part in the sessions of the French Parliament, whilst black generals reached the main political roles. Toussaint Louverture, on the left, was the first non-European governor of Haiti. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was the emperor of the former province as Jacques le Premier, James I. In such a mixture of old and new roles, we can observe the first steps of a different society, something that inspired other riots all over the world, and that we still celebrate every 23rd of August, the International Day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. Although many countries, from France to the United States, tried to hold back the rebels so that their example was not followed anywhere else, Haiti became independent at the cost of several victims and of an infamous amount of money requested by the French government. Their story should appear next to that of the French Revolution and vary the monolithic account of our past, even when minorities intertwined with the supposed main history. Dear Queer Muse, I know you could go on forever, but for us it's time to wrap up and draw some conclusions under your queer edges. We analyzed some literary and historiographical examples under the lens of queerness, and in doing so, we expanded the original meaning of queer and used it as a tool to emphasize and deconstruct the different types of barriers. Gender, first of all, but also more generally social, cultural, and geographical barriers that prevent us from looking at diversity in literature and history not as a contemporary need, but as a historical phenomenon that echoes through different ages and cultures. With this in mind, we hope to become your allies in the course of our experience as students and teachers, so as to recognize and welcome more and more nuances of the past and present world and reality. To be moved by you, Queer Muse, will be a vital antidote against garrulous believers in literature and history as monoliths, as straight lines, straight in all senses, as context where the cruelest acts should be understood. You, Queer Muse, can show us that even in the most obscure, sanctimonious, and intolerant ages of human history, there were individuals and groups who defied the prevailing mentality and tradition, and at the cost of their freedom and heads, affirmed counter-canonical roles, behaviors, and practices. It is by dwelling on them, something that the canonical historiography tends to hide, that we may have a new, varied, and aware look at what we were and at what we are or not becoming. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Johnny. So, we are a small group, we are among friends. So, who has a question? Doubts, things that you want to know more? You know?
Hi.
Hi.
It's weird. I've had on my phone forever. Okay, so one of my favorite pieces of your speech was when you were speaking about kind of context, and I can think of a lot of examples in my personal education in the U.S. In which, you know, that the idea of kind of, well, we have to set these tragedies in context at a time. Like, I can point to in my education, like, specific examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious as to if you feel that, like, in your education, like, places that you would point to where you feel that that was kind of like an excuse made to kind of justify a lot of the atrocities that were occurring.
Mm-hmm. When I studied in Italy, of course, there was no room for doubt. And I didn't study like 2 centuries ago. So you went in class, you worshipped the idol, and you went out. So I became more aware of this issue later in my life. But of course, the problem, more than the context, is the language. So how those events, those cruel events, are described and presented. Especially violence, for example, harassment and all the degrees of harassment that you can think of, especially in the myth, are presented like love affairs. So not only historical events, but also myth. If you go to Bertolio and you go under the Loggia dei Lanzi, you have a scene of rape, and everything is fine with it. And if you study that scene in school, you probably analyze in a very detailed way the metaphors, the style of how this scene is represented. So before coming to the really cruel events that are openly cruel, even other kind of stories, of course fictitious stories, but are always violent stories, are presented in a language that is not aware of the violence behind the words. So I think that that's a big problem, because in Italy you study a lot of myth, Roman myth, Greek myths, and the texts that describe the myth, the origin of Rome. There's a fight between 2 twins, and one kills the other, and their mother had a relation with Marte, the god of war. So you are exposed to all this violence, but with not appropriate words. So there's a big issue. Of course, even in the US universities, about trigger warnings and all that. And that's a problem. So I would have liked to have a different education, more from that point of view, and then of course for the historical accounts.
Thank you, it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Be shy. No? Can I ask you something? It's a little bit off topic, but it's something that I think you might be interested on. No? You know about the use of prompts, and I think that you are starting to study Italian language. Italian language, it's all about gender, no? It's female or male, no? So you might be wondering what is happening now and what we're trying to do with people that decide not to identify with their born gender, and how is going with the use of pronouns in Italian, and which are the proposal, because I know about my student that they asked me to use the they, for example, but now that you're starting to study Italian, you might wonder how does it work in Italian, no? Plural, singular, female, male, is difficult. So if you want to tell a little bit about schwa and those things. I know it's a little bit off topic, but they might be interested.
When you have to sign a document in Italy, you have to choose between M and F, right? Always, always. There's no other options. And that tells a lot of our values and traditions. Now there is a big debate, but it's more a debate, a theoretical debate, more than a practical, with limited practical effect. And the big issue is to address people in official communications, for example, emails, letters, when you don't know exactly if if the people you're addressing are M or F.
Or either of two.
Or non-binary, yes, but that doesn't matter to the authors of these official emails. So at the beginning of this debate, they proposed the star. So instead of the O or the A, male and female endings, you used like dear and then a star. And that star covered male, female, non-binary, example. Now, since the star, you cannot pronounce the star, so you, like here, if I want to see cari tutti to welcome you, I cannot say car star, tut star, right? So they found, and especially a socio-linguistic professional from Florence actually, proposed something that was already used in LGBTQ communities. So instead of the star, the schwa. Schwa is written like an inverted E. Ecco, sorry. The inverted E, right? Speaking about inversion. So they used the schwa, they proposed the schwa instead of O and A, because technically you can pronounce it. It's a sound. It's a it's an indefinite sound. I'm sure there is in English, in some words, English has so many sounds and vowels, and I'm sure the schwa is included in some words. It's like a okay? So if I want to address an audience, and I don't really know if there are only women, only men, non-binary, people that are queer, so they are against the idea of gender, in some, sorry. I can say the schwa, so I can say care tutte, and if I want to ask a question and I don't want to be assertive, I can use the schwa at the end of the end, instead of the regular ending. And it works basically as they in English. It's the equivalent of they in English, but with they you have verbs, you have pronouns, you have their, you have them, themselves. They are with schwa. You just use schwa as the ending of words. Okay, so you cannot really conjugate verbs with the schwa. Okay. It's a big issue recently, and also in Spain and other languages. In some languages, when they have the neutral form, so you have female, male, and neutral, they use neutral for non-binary, for example. But someone says, I'm not an object, because neutral is the gender of things, of objects, so you don't want to be identified as an object. So you want to be identified as a person, as the other people. So it's a big issue. There's also a problem with e-book, for example, with Audible, because the system, the machine, is not yet able to read the schwa. So if you use the schwa in a book, for example, and you write the masterpiece of this century, and you put the text of the book in this machine, the machine is not intelligent enough to read the schwa. So that's another issue that the anti-schwa maintain. So it's a huge debate. But I really like that we are talking about it, because if we talk about it, it means that people perceive it as something that we need to discuss. So that's a good sign, at least.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you for, again, this brilliant lecture. You touched on so many things, and I'm super happy because some of my students had the chance of discussing fascist ideology, so you touch base on a lot of very important things. I do have a silly question. Considering the current, I don't want to say political, but just cultural situation in Italy, do you feel optimistic in relationship to your queer muse? You think your queer muse, I mean our queer muse, is welcome, or she is going, are they going, my bad, that tells a lot of me and my generation, or are they going through hard times?
Yes, I thought a lot about it, because in some, for some people, speaking about, for example, Dante and the Muslim world, or gay poets during the Renaissance period, are fake news. They are perceived as attack, or something that you manipulate to prove your existence, basically. So, I don't know if I would have this talk if I know for sure that the audience would be from that side of politics, because I'm sure that this is not the means you can persuade them to support your cause. With them, you have to speak like emotionally. You have to say something more. Probably, if they have a non-binary daughter or son, that would work. But not this lecture. Sorry, this is not snobbish, but it's what it is. You cannot use these arguments to convince them. There's no way. So I'm not optimistic because I wouldn't use this, but I'm optimistic in the sense they will have proof at some point that their arguments are bullshit. Sorry. So, but again, not through this type of issue. So I like the idea of counter, the idea of understories, the idea of show what we did or our grandparents did in the past with students. But for that generation, I think it's a lost battle. Can you see that in English?
Guys, any doubt? Anything you know about the story? I don't know how much you know about contemporary or modern Italian history. You probably know about racism during World War II. I don't know how much you know about colonies that Italy started to add in Africa, trying to imitate the idea of the big empire. So this is a big issue, the relationships that Italy had with the colonies, the exploitation of those territories. And if you think of the poor and the elite, and how much you're following the news, Italy is now at the center of big European problems for how we are treating the migrants that they are arriving in southern Italy and in the island. So it's a big political issue right now. So and it has big roots.
If you're interested in this portrait of Dante, on the left, this is probably the first portrait of Dante, and it's in the Fusion Lab. It's a restaurant now, and you can have a lunch with Dante on your left, I guess, it's on the wall. And I put it in the slide because it's a completely different portrait compared to the portrait that we have on the euros. For the 2 euros, the coin, there's a portrait of Dante coming from this Raffaello's portrait in Rome, but it's completely different. So it's a sign also from a visual point of view, the way they canonize Dante with the laurel, with the crown, with this severe gaze, which is probably not as the original Dante, with a more peaceful gaze and expression. So, and it's interesting that the original portrait is in a restaurant, and the canonized portrait is in the coin in a museum.